Hi everyone, welcome to our 5th demo video in this series where we discuss value. Value drawing is the next unit in our course and is sort of the natural flow for us to follow here. We've been focusing on drawing that helps us get things in proportion on our paper and placing them with perceptual accuracy, including all these checks and balances as tools for us to learn how we can be more accurate with our drawing when drawing from life. When we move into value, we start to think about light and the lighting of our situation. So we're going to be using a variety of different strategies to convey the three-dimensionality of our objects and the light that is being cast on them by the environment. Having a believable light structure in our drawings will be the thing that helps us more fully convey a sense of the real in our drawings. So what do we mean by value? In the sense of drawing from life, we're using value to refer to the amount of light or shadow that's being reflected from our objects to our eye, to the optic nerve. When we perceive light, it's bouncing off of those objects, and we have a responsibility in drawing the subject to translate that. Where are our darkest shadows, and where are our objects catching the most light? For an example, I grab an egg. I'll use this as a demonstration because there's no really confusing colors, it's just one even tone of white and the shadow falls across it, and we'll use it to understand some of the components of value drawing and a couple of pieces of vocabulary. So while my dog barks at everything in the neighborhood, let's see how I handled this egg. I'm going to just draw it with graphite here and get straight to the vocabulary. For fans of last week's drawing, you can see me using some negative space here to help bring my egg into focus. Now that I've got it complete, I label some parts of the drawing. The darkest shadow underneath the egg we call the umbra, whereas the more diffuse shadow around the edge of its cast shadow we call the penumbra, the edge of the shadow. The lightmost facing surface of the egg we can call the highlight. The middle transitional area we generally refer to as midtones. And the non-light facing side we can call the shadow or the lowlight. A term I'd like us to remember for the umbra and penumbra, we don't really need to know those words. The word we really need to know is cast shadow. Paying attention to cast shadows in your still lifes is one of the number one things that will help your drawings instantly feel more dimensional. We'll get there with our ability to shade and to gradate, and those are things that take time, but the cast shadows are really part of the structure. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Now there are lots of moving parts to a value drawing, so we're just going to introduce things step by step. Using the techniques that we've already established with a gesture drawing and underdrawing, we'll work our way into value with the charcoal. I set up a new piece of paper for myself on my drawing table, and I also set up a new still life for myself, something that I find really, really interesting and is very seasonally appropriate. Some great pumpkins and gourds from the grocery store, along with some mums that I've got in the background, stacked up in this neat little way. You're already familiar with the drawing tools that we'll be using this time, and so I feel like it's a great time to introduce the viewfinder. A viewfinder is simply a tool that we look through to help us find an interesting composition within our still life. You can also use it to take some really basic measurements to help you find proportions quickly. You'll note that my viewfinder is the same proportion as my paper. So for me, that's pretty close to square, but not quite. A little bit more horizontal than that, but I've made sure that my viewfinder, even though it's not the same size in the opening as my paper, it's the same proportions. For your work, you'll be working on 18 by 24 sheets, so I recommend here, I'll do some math on the side of my drawing. It looks like a 3 to 4 inch opening or a 6 to 8 inch opening in your viewfinders if you choose to make them. I just made mine out of cardboard that I got from a package I had shipped to me. If you make those viewfinders, those are some good sizes to make the interior hole for your drawings. They'll match up nicely. Looking through my viewfinder and keeping it as best as I can in the same place, I do a quick gesture drawing of my still life. I'm placing the pumpkins, the mass of the flowers behind them. I move to the gourds in front, the box the right pumpkin is sitting on, and I quickly notate where the ridges in the pumpkins are, because I think that's an important structural part of my drawing. With my rough gesture drawing complete, I wipe out using my hand, and the vine charcoal remains where I've drawn those lines. Again, double checking with my viewfinder. This is where it really comes in handy, because now I'm doing my underdrawing and I want to check proportions, angles, and everything about the composition to make sure that it's perceptually accurate. Now you guys have seen me do a million underdrawings since we began, so I speed this up nice and fast. Remember that I'm using plenty of ad hoc measurements, taking angles, adding verticals and horizontals as need be, and taking internal measurements. And finally, I get the composition looking just like I want it, and I add a little bit of extra info to finish off what I consider a good composition. Now that I've got everything placed accurately, I can wipe out again, and thankfully my vine charcoal is really nicely still showing up as a ghost image, and I'll be able to work directly into this. At this stage, I'm ready to begin thinking about value, and I take stock of where the lights and shadows are in my composition. I decide to start by thinking of the highlights first. And thankfully, I can do this in a special way now that we have a really nice toned ground thanks to that vine charcoal. We're going to use our kneaded eraser as a drawing tool to lift out the brightest lights reflecting off the pumpkins. In value drawing, we can really see that thinking of the eraser as just a tool that helps us remove mistakes, it might be a little bit shortchanging the eraser. With a toned ground, the eraser becomes a tool to draw just like your charcoal, and arguably it can be even more important to preserve that light of the paper to help the objects feel luminous and sculptural. We want ultimately to have a really wide range of values in our drawing, so it can have both depth and good contrast, and that really will mimic life very closely. You can see me even breaking off a piece of my kneaded eraser so I can get a little bit more specific. Sometimes it can help to keep the kneaded eraser small so you can make very fine marks. Already the drawing is starting to feel sculptural and three-dimensional. And now that I've got my erasers in and the bright of the paper pulled out, I move into my compressed charcoal brick, thinking, okay, I've got the lightest lights. What are the darkest darks in this still life? Let's take a look here. Now, excluding local color, so we're not looking at the stripes on the pumpkins per se, I'm noticing the cast shadows are really the strongest underneath the pumpkins, sort of between them, as well as some real shadows kind of trapped in that very dense bouquet of flowers behind the still life. I maneuver my compressed charcoal as deftly as I can, although it is a little bit crude for some of this application since my paper is a little bit smaller than the one that you'll be doing. But nevertheless, I press on and I try to find those darkest darks and put them in faithfully, knowing that I'm going to get more specific later in the drawing. I follow those dark valleys and folds in the pumpkin up to the cavity in the center where the stem is, and notice that that's a real area of darkness also. At this point with my drawing, I'm approaching probably the hour-and-a-half mark, starting with my gesture drawing into the underdrawing, and now just moving into the eraser and compressed charcoal. So I've got quite a bit of work left to do, although my structure is looking good and things are starting to appear dimensional. But yeah, I've got a ways to go to get this to really feel like light is passing over these pumpkins, especially work with the shadows. I start thinking about some midtones using the charcoal brick on its side. Eventually these will sort of get moved around, but it's nice to have a little bit of tone on the paper in the places where I know it'll get darker. You can see me working within the flowers and the leaves in the flowers using some of the negative space techniques that we employed in last week's homework and last week's class. Sometimes drawing the area around an object can help us remember that there's less light in what's going on behind those objects, and it can help pull the sort of medium tones or the medium values forward. It's getting a little bit later in the day, and the light is slowly changing over my still life, but thankfully I've set up a small lamp so I can remember where the light's coming from. Even on my drawing board, you can see there I put the little sun with an arrow facing right, so I always have to remember every time I look down that the light is coming from the left and really catching on those pumpkins and the shadows on the right side. So obviously I've switched to my charcoal pencil because I feel, for the moment at least, that I've done the most that I can do with the charcoal brick without really getting very heavy. So I switch to the charcoal pencil, going into those flowers and the leaves, and using both negative space drawing as well as some a light touch for those midtones and darker darks to kind of get some detail in there without going a little too overboard. Here you can see I was having a little bit of trouble keeping my hand out of the charcoal, so I switched to using this bridge. I think I talked about the bridge in class very briefly. It's just a piece of wood with some little extra wooden boards on the bottom, so it forms a bridge over the drawing, so it doesn't touch any of the drawing surface. But remember, you can just use a slip sheet. Tear out a little extra sheet of paper, just about maybe twice the size of your hand, rest it on your drawing surface, and you can rest your hand right on top of it without any fear of smudging. One thing I see frequently from beginning drawing students when we move into value is they still hold on to a lot of line work in their drawings. Now, you might say that I've got line going on in my drawings, but I would push back on that a little bit. Yes, I have skinny areas of value, but am I thinking about it in line like a contour drawing? I would say no. There are really, in reality, and we obviously can all observe this if you look around, there are no lines on the edges of the objects in front of us, right? There are no lines in life. Lines are kind of an abstraction that we use to make things more understandable. Really what we have is a light surface coming up against a dark surface or a medium surface. And so there's no external line actually in reality, and we have to grapple with that fact in value drawing. If you just take my pumpkin on the right as an example, you can see I just have a light surface, the white of the paper, up against the darkness of the plants in the background, and that communicates that there is a value shift there between an object that's in light and some leaves that are, for the most part, out of the main light. Now that I've got the majority of the value laid in, I feel more comfortable and more at ease doing some of the detail work. Now, these gourds are very textural, so here I am starting to think more specifically about each object now that I've got their general light structure. I start to add these little warts on some of the smaller gourds that show up all over the place. Even when I get to the details, even of those small little warts, you can see me treating them like sculptural objects. They do protrude from that surface, and so they cast their own shadow. They have the sort of light structure of tiny little spheres embedded in the surface of that gourd, so I treat them like that. I use my charcoal pencil to start to blend around some of those rougher midtones that I put in with my charcoal brick earlier, and I also want to start to think about the surface quality of that left pumpkin. The surface quality of all the objects obviously is important, and here I am making a little edit on my chair in the background of my kitchen table. But I want to encourage you, when you get to this point in the drawing, it can be easy to be like, it's good enough. But if you really ask yourself, there is, as we say, a little meat left on that bone. You can push yourself to mimic as closely as possible the surface quality in charcoal. Charcoal is very flexible in that regard. I'm finishing up with my drawing, and I decide that I need to make these cast shadows a little clearer. I had walked away for 15 minutes to put the baby down for a nap, and I came back and saw, that pumpkin on the left really is casting a much darker shadow on some of these objects. Now, sometimes a little walk away from the surface in front of you can really reveal something about the drawing as a whole. And for me, this helped make it a much more cohesive, well-lit structure and much more believable, because that pumpkin was casting a little bit of a deeper shadow that I hadn't fully reckoned with. So there's always time to edit, and I recommend backing up from your drawing several times during the process, and you'll start to see things that you can't up close. So that about does it for this drawing. In total, I want to say this took me about 2.5 hours start to finish. There were some interruptions in there, of course, because that's just the way life is. But don't get discouraged by that. As long as you can make your lighting conditions the same every time, and I really encourage you to set up some artificial lighting in any way possible, especially if it's directional, like I was able to do here. You'll get something really interesting. But if you can, return in the same conditions, then it can be really helpful to step away from the drawing for a minute. I think that improved my overall product in the end. Now, we could go further with this, getting the surface quality of all these objects to get really specific and feel exactly like pumpkins and gourds. But, we want to keep it where it's at right now, and get you guys up to speed with value drawing. And, we'll see how you do, see how you enjoy it.